guys, welcome back to Life on the Wrist. Today we're going to be talking about a watch that is extremely important to me. It was the first vintage watch that I ever purchased. It is the Memosail Yacht Timer. We've done a couple of videos where we've discussed this watch, but I think it'd be useful for us to kind of go over the history of the watch so that it's documented as a video. We did create, back in, I believe, April of last year, we created a post where we discussed the entire history of the Memosail watch. It's kind of founding as well as the watches that kind of came from it, the various variations that there are of the Memosail, and I really enjoyed writing up this piece. I will give a shout out to the sources at the end of this video, but I think today we're going to kind of go over the history. I'll put a link in the description to the post that we wrote about it. If you haven't seen the Memosail that I purchased, this was the first ever vintage watch that I purchased. It's a Memosail Yacht Timer from the 70s. This is one of the early versions of it, with a very iconic round case with a 10 minutes disc that spins as the chronograph is used, and this watch was used to time the races, the boat races. So we'll go over the history of this watch, and so that you're aware of it. So that's going to be the topic for today. If you haven't seen any other videos, I say it every time after I give the topic, be sure to smash the like button for us, really does help us out. Let's get this piece as many likes as we possibly can, especially because it is very important to me. Also, the subscribe button is right next to it. If you like these types of videos, be sure to hit the subscribe button and join the Life on the Wrist family. So just to give you an idea of how this watch works, this is a yacht timer. In boat races, it's kind of hard to have a start line. It's kind of hard to have all these boats line up at one starting line. So what ends up happening is the boats, a horn is sounded in a boat race, and that indicates that there are 10 minutes until all the boats should be at the starting line, and then the race will begin. So when that first horn goes off, the user of this watch will end up starting the chronograph by pressing the top button, and the chronograph will start spinning. The disc that's on the inside spins for 10 minutes and ends up displaying the word start, and at that time the second horn should go off, and the yachtsman should know that that's when they should be at the starting line in order to get the boat race underway. So that's how the watch is used. The Memosail is extremely unique. It's got an extremely blue dial, very unique shape, especially the other ones that Memosail ended up creating. The history of the Memosail kind of started with the Yacht company, who filed a patent for the patent for the Memosail in 1972 on August the 9th. They wanted to compete with a lot of the other yacht timing chronographs that were around at that time, which was watches like the Aquastar with their 5 dotted timer. There's a couple really interesting pieces that yacht timers had made, that were yacht timers. Like I mentioned, Fensa had created a watch that had essentially the disc, a similar disc, but there were dots that were on the top of the watch. They filed a patent in order to create the Memosail, which was going to be their watch to compete with this. There were other watches that the Memosail was competing with, but that was one of their main competitors. In order to do that, Yacht created a watch brand called Memosail, which was going to be the watch that ended up creating the watch company that ended up creating the Memosails. And they kind of leveraged their partnership with Valjoux to develop their own watch, their own yacht timer. In that same year, 1972, they filed a patent. The patent's number was CH566052, and the patent was for a chronograph mechanism timepiece, and this was essentially to adjust one of their Valjoux movements in order to have it be used as a yacht timer. The movement that they used for this patent, and what ended up going into watches like the Memosail that I own, was the Valjoux 7733 or the Valjoux 7734, and they modified it ever so slightly to accommodate for the creation of this yacht timer, and it was named the Valjoux 7737. The patent was actually written in French, and kind of the patent showed how the chronograph would kind of function with the center disc and the dial, which would end up being the timing mechanism for the yacht timer. Essentially what the modification to the movement was is the Valjoux 7733 or 7734 was a chronograph movement that had its chronograph wheel would move the chronograph timer every minute. But essentially what happened was that disc, there was a tooth that was added at 30 seconds. So when the chronograph hand passes 60 and 30, it will move that center disc halfway. So it essentially times every 30 seconds that elapses. So interesting patent that was filed. They had that and ended up using that patent and leveraging their relationship with Valjoux in order to create the yacht timer. There are some interesting pictures where all the components of the watch were outlined that I'll be sure to put up. And essentially the disc, the center disc, which is the focal point of the yacht timer, has a countdown from 1 to 10, and then it has the word start written on it. And this is the way that the individual who uses the yacht timer can see how long they have until they should be at the starting line of the boat race. And then as soon as the disc states start, that is when they should know that the race is about to begin. Now, in order to do that, in order for that to say start, they basically had to cut out part of the dial, which allows for that disc to be displayed on the dial. So that's another element that should be noted. So the original designs were similar to the one that I have right here. It is extremely round, very distinct, very 70s. The watch comes in 41 millimeters and is in a round case with no lugs. The case was made of chrome-plated brass, later made in stainless steel, which is quite sturdy and quite hefty, probably because it's going to be part of boat races, so it's probably going to want to be a little bit more sturdy. Ironically, this isn't a screw down. There aren't screw down crowns on this. There aren't screw down pushers, which I feel like would have made sense, especially with something that's going to be in water, probably getting wet. So interesting part of it. The watch came with an interesting brochure and kind of a very rudimentary box. The first couple versions of the watch came with the 1/5 of a second indicators between each of the seconds hands. So if you look at mine, you can see that each second is indicated around the outside of the dial. But the ones before this actually came with the 1/5 of a second indicated. So a lot busier outer ring, but later versions only had the seconds. Then you have the hours and minutes hands, which tell the time on the inside of the watch. They're a little bit shorter, don't really go all the way out to the outside of the dial, but the outside of the dial is used for the yacht timing. Later, after the round case was sold, they came out with a cushion form case, which is actually, I really like the cushion form case. I think it probably sits a little bit nicer on your wrist. There are other iterations of the Memosail that end up being released, like the VIP Memosail. The VIP Memosail were sold in a very distinct presentation box and had their own very distinct cushion form cases that measured approximately 44 millimeters, so a little bit larger. There are a lot of dial variations that came that were available. Some had gray inner dials. Others had a very blue inner dial. That's another thing that I kind of like about the Memosail, is there's a lot of variations you can probably collect. This Memosail VIP used the Valjoux 7767. It was different from the 7733 or 34 or 37 because the center disc actually revolved clockwise, which meant it had a continuous movement every 30 seconds. These Memosail VIPs were released by Memotime up until the 1980s, where they adjusted the kind of case design. And they also released their first, after the Memosail VIPs were released, they released their first Memosail automatic. This design was quite different than the original Memosail. Instead of having a center disc like this, they ended up having red, blue, and white dots, similar to their competitors, like the other regatta timers that were released during that time. They had dots as opposed to that center wheel, and the dots would indicate when their race started. They also, on these new versions of the Memosail automatics, they added a bezel which was able to tell them which direction that they were sailing in, but also sail positions. And with that, they ended up moving to the Valjoux 7757, which was also using the Atlantic Skipper. This was a automatic winding watch as opposed to the manual winding watch that is the Memosail that I own and some of the earlier versions. And then around the same era that this automatic watch came out was there was a lot of quartz watches that were being released, and they were in high demand. And so Memosail, being that in order to kind of cater to those who wanted those quartz watches, they ended up creating a quartz version of the Memosail. There are very few images of this watch available, probably because they didn't sell for very much, but they sold for around $240 and $260 US dollars respectively. So they came on nylon straps, but also on steel straps. Then in kind of the late 80s, 1989, they released a very special version of their yacht timer called the Memosurf. This was kind of their fun way of kind of creating quartz watches, and they came out with very interesting case designs where the chronograph buttons are at the top of the watch. They kind of remind me of collecting Timex watches. They're very fun. They come in very bright colors, and you can have a lot of fun with them. Kind of going into Memotime, they were able to be one of the sponsors for the America's Cup sailing competition in 1992, so they obviously did fairly well and kind of gained a lot of traction, and were the sponsors of one of the vessels that was used in the America's Cup. After this, Memosail released the Memosail Skipper and Memosail Skipper Jubilee, which are extremely rare versions of the Memosail. These were made in very limited quantities. They ran off the Valjoux 7757, but they were almost like the dressier version of the Memosail. They were a little bit cleaner dials, much more understated, and just looked very beautiful. Their campaign was for a flying start. This was essentially to say that they would help those who were looking to do well in yacht races, and like I said, very clean dials, a little bit more time and energy put into the aesthetics of the dial, and they look very beautiful, but it still has that iconic orange hand that would indicate when the chronograph was running and when it was not. The Memosail watches kind of sold until about 2000, and then Memosail was purchased by Corum, and they tried to relaunch the Memosail watch, but didn't really launch in the correct way, and we didn't really see a new Memosail up until about 2003, where they created ETA based, and then in 2003 Memotime created some new versions of the Memosail Skipper, and those sold between 2003 and 2015. They came in both quartz movements as well as ETA movements, but they kind of didn't really launch very heavily. There are some variations that have been released. They come in different variations, but again, they're not similar to those Memosail Jubilee versions. They are a little bit busier. The crown, the outer ring, there is a compass located on the bezel of the watch. They still use the dots as opposed to the ring that you can see in the 70s version of the Memosail. But I think that's just because of ease of legibility, and I think it is a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, I think, to a wider audience, especially because this Memosail is a little bit more niche. So that's kind of the history of the Memosail that I was able to trace. I want to give a huge thank you to Regatta Yacht Timers and Hoyer Chrono, because you guys have those two sources those were my two main sources for the article that I put together, but also the information that I know about the kind of, we know as a watch community, know about the Memosail Yacht Timer. So huge thank you to those two blogs. I hope you found this useful. I really do love this watch. It was my first vintage watch purchase, so I might be biased, but again, like, this is everything I really wanted in a vintage watch. So I hope that is useful. I'm glad I was able to create this video so that we could trace the history of the Memosail in video form. I'll be sure to put a link into the article that I wrote discussing the history of the Memosail. If you've made it this far and you haven't already, be sure to smash that like button for us if you like the Memosail and you've enjoyed this video. Also, the subscribe button is really, really close, so be sure to hit that subscribe button. And with that said, guys, hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time.